Dr. John Camillus holds the Donald R. Beale Endowed Chair at Katz and has done so since 1992. He's previously Professor of Management at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad and received his Doctorate of Business Administration from Harvard University. He's earned both a gold medalist and distinguished alumnus from the MBA program at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. He has earned his Bachelor of Technology at the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras. He's been published extensively in Harvard Business Review, Management Science, Sloan Management Review, Long Range Planning, and in fact, the session in which he's going to be discussing today was published in Harvard Business Review. He's consulted in over 80 organizations in 4 continents across for-profit and non-profit organizations. He's received numerous teaching awards. Most recently is the 2013 Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award for the Katz MBA program, and has already earned 2 of the 3 of the highest awards given at the University of Pittsburgh, that being the Chancellor's Distinguished Teaching Award and the Chancellor's Distinguished Public Service Award. On a personal note, I've known John for well over 15 years. John taught me strategy. I'm delighted to have him here as a representative of our program, and I think you will understand why as he goes through the program. So John, we're so happy to have you here and look forward to your discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bill, and good morning. I'm absolutely delighted to share some thoughts with you about a topic that addresses an issue which is somewhat subtle but has an enormous impact on strategy making. The kind of problem you're talking about today, wicked problems, were first identified and formally looked at in the area of urban planning and public policy, and I think it's very apropos what's going on today in the information technology, information systems arena. To the phrase wicked problem, and the understanding of this kind of problem developed rapidly, and you can understand its relevance to that area by looking at what's happening today in healthcare.gov. These are really, really challenging problems which if you don't approach in a particular fashion, you really end up the creek without a paddle, as they say. In the strategy area, it's becoming more and more of a significant issue which people are beginning to realize is something they cannot afford to overlook. And the fascinating thing is these problems are not amenable to just more analysis or more hard work or burning the midnight oil or being very smart. They actually demand an extraordinarily different approach in terms of solving them. And what we will do today is try to help you understand what a wicked problem is. And while there's a lot written about it, there are 5 criteria that I'd like you to think about when you face a problem to figure out whether it's wicked or not. First, of course, is the notion, is this a new problem? If you've seen it before and have handled it well, it is probably amenable to the traditional problem-solving methodology and the traditional analytical framework. The second thing to think about, which is becoming more and more important today, is the notion of significant stakeholders. Are there many people who are interested in the issue that you're looking at and the consequences of your decisions? Are there values and priorities in alignment or different? And if they are different, you can understand why it becomes an issue which cannot be solved by just you sitting in a chair and thinking deep thoughts. You can see this in the public policy arena if you look at issues such as immigration or poverty. Clearly, there are very many people interested in this from a variety of perspectives, and it raises also the issue of what are the causes of the problem. If you're talking about strategic issues that you are addressing, the problems could be because of regulation, the problems could be because of political developments, the problems could be because of technological developments, disruptive technologies, and it goes on and on. The fourth consideration I'd like you to think about is this problem that you're facing one that enables you to say, I have a solution and this is the right solution. If you cannot be sure that you have the right solution, when there's no stopping rule where you say, I have a solution that works and it's probably the best, you it does have a characteristic of a wicked problem. And finally, this is an interesting notion. Does the understanding of what the problem is change when it's reviewed in the context of alternative proposed solutions? In my article in Harvard Business Review, I looked at the issue of Walmart. Now, the problem might be one of growth, if you perceive it in a particular fashion, and so you decide to go into the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China because of the demographic reasons. But then you might say, really, the problem is we have saturated the world with a $440 billion of revenue, and maybe the issue is what other alternative business domains should be addressed, and then the nature of the issues change, the nature of the problem changes, and it goes back to the issue of if you don't know what the problem is, how do you know you have the correct solution? So keep these 5 criteria in mind. I think they are very powerful in helping you understand whether you are tackling a wicked problem or not. If you look at management, and if you look at strategy, the reason there are managers and the reason why strategy is difficult is because of 2 factors, complexity and uncertainty. And in this little 2x2, we are essentially training people, and they are well trained to handle issues which are, I would label them as tame, where the causes are understood, where there's some volatility around a point in the future, but it's essentially amenable to prediction. Whereas wicked issues are tacit and tangled causes, and the environment is one of chaotic ambiguity. And we'll talk about how to address this. One reassuring factor, study this in great detail in a variety of areas, and the answers are actually not too difficult. As long as you understand that you need to do things differently than normally. So having some kind of an understanding of what is a wicked problem, I'd like to look at what the conventional managerial wisdom is. And in terms of presenting that, I'd like to go back to an article which was in an issue of the Harvard Business Review, which was looking at the problems caused by the recession. And this was the lead article in an issue saying, how does one handle the problems of the recession? And written by 2 very distinguished authors. And their advice is in these 2 slides, which I'll show you. Let me read a couple of suggestions. Protect financial fundamentals by monitoring and maximizing cash flow, managing customer risk, credit risk, reducing working capital. I can go to the point number 2, reduce costs, increase organizational efficiency, work to maximize the valuation relative to rivals, just picking a couple of ideas, recruit the best available talent, and so on. When you see these kinds of recommendations, it's fascinating because it sort of illuminates the reality that people don't really understand that wicked problems are a different domain. Are a different animal altogether. What you have here is advice that is excellent. What is excellent? It's advice that's excellent in good times or bad times, and all they're telling you to do is to work harder. So what you're going to talk about is not just working harder, because that will not help you with the wicked problem, but working smart and differently, and we'll talk about that in some more detail as we go through. What I'd like to share with you is the origins of wickedness, so to speak, and essentially to give you a sense that this was not some kind of brilliant notion that people came up with a couple of years ago. It's something that's been brewing, that we've been studying for years, and if you look at companies like General Electric and Rockwell, they're iconic benchmarks of what to do in situations where complexity and uncertainty are extreme. On the other hand, you can look at organizations such as Enron and Westinghouse, the old Westinghouse, and you can see why they fail, because they saw the world as linear and used approaches that perhaps were not responsive to the characteristics of wicked problems. We have conducted with the American Productivity and Quality Center benchmarking studies around the world, looking at 22 companies around the world, sponsored by 87 companies. So essentially, we analyzed 109 companies. And these are a few of some of the companies that we looked at around the world. And in addition, we are currently looking at a whole bunch of other companies that we have recently studied or continuing to study in the field. And what we are talking about over the next 25 minutes or so are essentially lessons that we have drawn by looking at this wide variety of extraordinarily well-managed companies. Before we go into how to respond to wicked problems, I just want to spend 10 seconds to remind you of a very simple notion of strategy. You have an organization, you have an environment in which, a business environment in which the organization operates. And strategy is really the construct, the set of ideas that help you meld, harmonize, if I could use that word, the organization and its environment. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about the environment we are facing today. And while you might see things differently, I'm sure you'll agree that there are some major developments, and I'm going to share 3 of them, which impact all of us. And one is globalization. The issue of globalization is something that's important to you, even if you think of yourself as a local company focusing on a particular region in a particular country, because you cannot avoid globalization even if your market is local, because there's global sourcing, there's global competition, standards are set in a global fashion these days in many industries, there are global expectations of what quality should be, and of course there are global markets which keep pulling you to address them. There's a notion of partnerships that are global to help you develop better products, engage in R&D, get better distribution in place. Global financing, especially if you're an entrepreneur, you might be surprised to learn there's an enormous proportion of financing for startups that actually are global in origin. So when you look at this and add one more factor, if you go back to the Goldman Sachs study about BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the economic center of gravity is moving towards these countries, away from the traditional triad of North America, Europe, and Japan. And when you look at these new emerging economies, there is the notion of the next 4 billion customers. And these customers are very different than what we are used to. They have less disposable income. They tend to earn very, very low amount of money every day. And but at the same time, there are so many of them. The estimate is 4 to 5 billion that are not being served by organized firms right now, that you cannot really ignore them. Now, the other mega force is the imperative of innovation. I'm not going to spend time on this. Whether it is a country or whether it's a company, it's inevitable. If you want to maintain your place or you want to improve your position, innovation is the key. And what I want you to recognize is that innovation and globalization interact. The guru Clayton Christensen on disruptive technologies actually wrote about this where he talked about the great leap driving innovation from the base of the pyramid, and he saw disruptive technologies emerging not by focusing on very structured R&D in the developed economies, but actually trying to address the needs of large low-income populations in the emerging economies. He saw that as the primary source of new technologies and new business models. The third notion I'd like you to think about is the notion of shared value that Porter and Kramer have been talking about. And very simply, what that means is that economic value and social value are linked and synergistic. If your business model incorporates social benefit into it, your economic results tend to improve. And if you connect these, this notion of multiple stakeholders being important and whose needs you're addressing, then the complexity and uncertainty that's created by globalization is compounded by the multiple stakeholders that are recognized in a shared value model, and you have the beginnings of inevitable wicked problems. Complexity and uncertainty get heightened. If you look at innovation and shared value, there's a notion of co-creation of value. And again, there's been some articles recently, actually this year, on innovating for shared value. So the interaction between all of these is extraordinarily important. And what we are talking about today is the notion of the interaction of the interactions. You put together disruptive technologies, co-creation of value, great complexity and uncertainty, wicked problems, which is what you're addressing today. I was looking for an acronym that sounds awful, and vocab does sound bad. So, and it's a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, and chaotic world that we are dealing with. And wanted to remind you about this. Wicked problems happen where the causes of the problem are tangled and inextricably tangled, and where there's chaotic ambiguity. In terms of responding to these problems, may I suggest a way of looking at them? There's the McKinsey 4S model, and for the last 35, 40 years, actually preceding the model, a couple of colleagues of mine and I have been essentially using a more streamlined version, which we call the 4S model, which starts with strategy, builds in the notion of structure, because we are talking about implementing strategy. Structure is key. And the moment you decide your structure, the way your strategy evolves is also affected. So these two are very, very tightly linked, in fact, inextricably linked, if I could phrase it again that way. There's a notion of what are the systems you use to develop strategy, what are the human resource systems that you employ, what are the control systems that you use to implement strategy. And the fourth notion I'd like you to think about is the notion of leadership or management style, the culture in the organization, critically important. I don't need to defend the importance of these four or the fact that they are linked. And it's a subset of McKinsey's 7S framework. The shared values that are talking about in the McKinsey 7S framework, which is not explicitly recognized in the 4S model. Shared values are part of the notion of strategy I'd like to develop with you. The notion of skills come up in the HR system and very much in strategy, because skills are the competencies the organization possesses, and staff gets picked up in the organization structure and the HR systems in the 4S model. So it's as comprehensive as the McKinsey 7S framework, but simpler to understand and implement. Now, if you look at the strategy arena in terms of responses for wicked problems, let me suggest something here. Going back to this model of strategy and looking at organizations, the way one tends to describe organizations is what are the boundaries. This, of course, is the transaction cost economics model that Ron Coase got his Nobel Prize on. Is it cheaper to conduct an activity within the organization, or is it cheaper actually to have this activity conducted outside the boundaries of the organization? And the notion of the economic determinants of firms, it's really critically important. There's the notion of structure. Are we a functionally organized organization? Are we an entrepreneurial organization? Are we divisionalized? Are we a conglomerate? There's a notion of what industry are you in? Are you in the music industry? Are you in steel? Are you in materials? Are you in retail? Fast-moving consumer goods? And finally, the notion of what is the strategy that you're employing is very often used to describe an organization. And the interesting thing is none of these are enduring notions anymore. When you're talking about outsourcing, when you're talking about alliances, the notion of boundaries starts fading into insignificance. Structures and hierarchy, what we discovered in the benchmarking studies is that structure has become a variable. People modify the structures in order to respond to emerging strategic problems. The concept of business, what business is IBM in? When I started out as an engineer, IBM was a mainframe company, evolved into a company that also embraced PCs. But if you look at IBM now, most of the revenues come from services and consulting. And so how do you define the business in which IBM is operating? And this is true for so many companies today. What business, I mean, if you talk about a product, for instance, such as an iPhone, if you describe it as a phone, you're dead. Okay, so you're really talking possibly about a mobile internet access device or whatever, but when you try to define an organization in terms of its products, markets, and technology, which was the simplest way of describing a strategy, strategies evolve. So what you're looking for now is something that's more lasting in order to define what an organization is. I'm using these terms which are in the literature. What is core, distinctive, and enduring about an organization? And essentially we're talking about three things. I'm not going to defend them because of lack of time, but values endure. aspirations endure. What are your goals? What are your visions? And your competencies. It takes years to develop a world-class competency. And essentially, I'm arguing that the notion of identity, which encompasses these three notions of values, aspirations, and competencies, is what defines an organization in an enduring fashion. So keep that in mind. Identity is key. That's actually the lens and the touchstone through which you evaluate strategic alternatives. If you're talking about about the importance of things such as values. Again, no time to look at this, but you'll be provided these slides, I know, later. And essentially, I want to talk about, share with you the thought that values can be extraordinarily powerful. And companies such as Marks and Spencer's became dominant companies in their time by emphasizing systems developed based on fundamental values such as keeping things simple and making sure that key stakeholders such as your employees, your suppliers, and your customers, their happiness, quote unquote, is taken care of. When you look at this today, when you talk about competencies and what endures and so on, the traditional model, which is stockholders being perhaps the sole focus, has evolved into maybe customers being given dominance, but in today's model and in the context of identity, employees are the ones who create the values for an organization. Employees are where competencies exist, and the way I'd like you to think about this is obviously stockholders and customers are important, but your employees take care of your customers, who then obviously provide you the value added, the revenue for your stock, which keeps the stockholders happy. So, in terms of structure, coming to the second notion, this is a traditional organization structure, two dimensions. It's hierarchical, and there's specialization within, say, a business unit. And then you have groups of business units, and I want to talk about that for a second. At the divisional level, you're talking about product, market, and technology strategies. At the group level, that's not what you're focusing on. If you know more about the product, market, and technologies than your divisional managers, you don't need them. So at the group level, just a quick thought here, what you're focusing on is what are the commonalities, what are the synergies that cut across the divisions, and you tend to focus at the group level, when you have a bunch of divisions reporting to you on the competencies that the divisions need, the synergies that develop because these competencies are shared, nurturing these competencies, developing new ones. That's really the focus of strategy at the group level. I'm not going to talk about the corporate at the conglomerate level. That's a tricky area, and for our argument, all I need is the group level. But if you take these two dimensions of hierarchy and differentiation, you can see how the traditional organization is high on hierarchy, high on differentiation. There's a notion of units which are, say, a collateral unit, which is essentially something that is somewhat temporary in character. It's a new venture. It's low in differentiation because you work together as a team, but there's also hierarchy because the leader of the team selects who is part of the team. And if you look at this, where it's high in differentiation, specialization is emphasized, and the hierarchy is relatively low, that is the typical characteristic of a traditional strategic business unit that has had a long history and has become stable. The model that I'd like you to think about is a very stylized version, and there are two notions here. One is it's extraordinarily modular and extraordinarily flexible. So you have on the left-hand side traditional strategic business units which you manage in a typical fashion. What you also have as a formal part of the organization is an explicit and constantly developing set of collateral or entrepreneurial ventures which take new ideas, employ your competencies in different ways. If they could grow, they could vanish. If they grow, then they might become a cluster unit, to use DeQuinn Mills's term for a strategic business unit. Or if they die, then what is important is you take your key personnel and move them back to the core unit. I'm using the word core instead of headquarters because the focus here is not on administration but on developing competencies. The core unit focuses on the competencies that give you competitive advantage. They focus on developing these competencies. They focus on taking your good personnel, retraining them and developing them further and sending them out to the business units or to a new entrepreneurial venture. But this is an organization structure that is designed to be flexible, change, accept transformation, in fact, stimulate transformation. In terms of systems, there's a lot of ideas here, and there'll be a bunch of slides I'll just skim over, but I want to share some thoughts with you here. One is the notion of what you measure is key. What you measure is what you get, and 60 years ago, General Electric came up with 8 key result areas, and they said every one of these is critical. You don't perform adequately in any of these, and the company does not have a future, a long-term future. So obviously there's profitability, which they define in interesting ways. The notion of residual income or income after capital charge, as Westinghouse called it, developed where you not only take income after tax, but deduct a capital charge to reflect the cost of the capital that you're using. Market share obviously became a very important notion, and these are self-explanatory. And essentially the thought to keep in mind is just profits will not do it for you in terms of sustainability. Now, I want to talk about a couple of these to give you some sense of where I'm going with the performance measurement idea. One is clearly the profitability idea that of residual income or income after capital charge is very powerful. It has evolved to build in the notion of risk with the measure of economic value added. This is popularly known, so I won't spend time on it. I want to spend a couple of seconds on market share. Market share doesn't work for wicked problems. Market share is very important in a traditional sense because it's a measure of your relative power in a given industry. But the very interesting thing about market share, as one of my friends, Liam Fahey, talked about in his consulting with IBM, he said, the problem with IBM is the large installed base, and the ability to move away from this base is very, very difficult. So if you look at what's happened to, especially the US, when the manufacturing of things such as video recorders and microwave ovens, which were developed here, took place in other countries, that's where all the technology developments happened. And if you're talking about a measure that gives you an indication of what your future ability to grow and sustain yourself is, the share of manufacturing is perhaps more important than market share. So there are notions of moving these measures into a future-oriented set of measures as opposed to a historically oriented set of measures. And if I could go to the last measure, the balance between short-term and long-term, there is a notion that Jack Welch at General Electric suggested, which I would like to bring to your attention, which is the notion of destroying your business. This is an idea that I want you to think about. While you have to continue your existing strategy with intense commitment and dedication, at the same time you have to engage in the paradoxical and schizophrenic activity of saying, how do I make this business obsolete myself before the competition does it to me? And that's what's required in order to handle a wicked problem. Now, this is what we know how to handle. The kind of uncertainty described here by Courtney, Kirkland, and Diggory is where you can predict the future. You can say, this is what our market share is going to be, this is what the GDP is going to be, this is what our revenue is going to be, and there's a certain point in the future with some volatility around it, which you can predict with confidence. And everything we teach about strategy traditionally is oriented towards this notion of what uncertainty is. And again, there's the classic model of forecasting, planning, controlling based on comparing actual to planned performance of feedback, going back into improving a forecast. And that is the traditional model which leads to this kind of very simplified strategic planning process, a focus on strengths and weaknesses, looking at you internally, opportunities and threats, looking at the external environment and developing strategy in the context of top management's values and stakeholder priorities. And this works only for an established strategy which you're committed to for obvious reasons. We are talking about changing a strategy or obsoleting a business. This just does not work. So when you're talking about uncertainty, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. And these are more likely to be the kinds of context you're facing in the health arena. You have no idea what the health business is going to be like 2 years from now. You don't know, even President Obama doesn't know. Okay. So in that context, to say a point in the future is irrelevant. There's an enormous range of possibilities. When Tata developed the nano car, which they targeted a $2,000 price point for it, extraordinary innovation. They had no idea whether they'd sell 150,000 cars or 2 million. So when you have that kind of uncertainty, you talk about a point in the future, is meaningless. And essentially here, what you have is a model of experimentation. You experiment, and things are going to go differently than you've figure an experiment. So the notion of failure is an irrelevant idea here. The notion here is understanding what's happening, checking on your assumptions, learning, adapting, and continuously sensing what you need to do, which is extraordinarily different than the episodic kind of strategic planning that traditionally is employed. So there are two paradigms here, and I'm not using this word loosely. These are extraordinarily different mindsets. Traditional strategy involves a prediction paradigm. I'd like to suggest to you that dealing with wicked problems needs a learning paradigm, or one might even go on to say a transformational paradigm. And here, in the traditional model, you're talking about a probable future, and you build a prediction model, describe this, you'll get these slides, it's self-explanatory. A doctoral student of mine, Dongle Code, develops very simple models, and this is traditional. Not going to spend time on it, just to share with you what exists. I've given you an example of how to do this. Focus on a few variables, develop a story connecting these variables, and giving you a story for this, and essentially going on to say what is a pessimistic outcome, what's an optimistic outcome, developing contingency plans for those, and obviously focusing your primary plan on the detailed, most likely situation. This is what all of us know how to do. But what I'd like you to think about is a situation of possibility scenarios. When you don't know what the world is going to be like, there's a universe of possibilities out there, and here really we are talking about thinking about how to do things in contexts that are extraordinarily different, which is opening your mind to possibilities. And there's a word here, a phrase here I'd like you to remember: robust actions. I'll come back to this. This is critically important in the context of wicked problems. In terms of building learning models, instead of saying what describes the future, we're talking about uncertainties, we're talking about outcomes of these uncertainties, we're talking about alternative scenarios, reflecting possible combinations of these. We're talking about, and this is the key word, robust actions. I'm going to repeat this a couple of times. The fascinating discovery that we made, that many of us have made, is that even in extraordinarily different scenarios, there's a common set of actions that make sense in all these very, very different worlds. And what I'm talking about is processes to identify these robust actions. And in each of these scenarios that we develop, we talk about what are the key issues and how do you respond to them. What I have here is the notion, this is a classic case study on EMI, which developed a CT scanner. They had no idea what the demand would be, entirely new technology. They had no idea when the big dogs would come in, like GE and Thomson and Philips and companies of that nature. And they had an enormous variety of possibilities, ranging from 50 units of sales a year to 3,000 units. The competition could come in less than a year. Maybe with patents and so on, they could keep the competition out for 3 years. And what you have, when you combine these possibilities, is 4 extraordinarily different scenarios. Again, self-explanatory. You'll get the slides, so won't spend time on that. But the interesting thing is when you start analyzing each of these scenarios, and you could do this in detail, but let me show you what the outcomes are. The robust actions that work in every single one of the scenarios is you have to sell in the US. This is the biggest market. So you have to sell, you sell to the top neurologists, that's what gets you the entry into the market. You have to build a sales organization in the US. You're a UK company, but you have to sell in the US, you better build a sales organization there. You have to partner in research and development. These are the technologies developed. You don't do it in isolation, it's in partnership with radiologists. That's how X-rays develop. In order to make this acceptable to hospital purchasing committees and to insurance companies and so on, you've got to present the advantages of these new technologies in conferences, working, of course, with the radiologists, professional papers, professional conferences. You have to have a training and service organization. This is an extraordinarily complex technology, and you have to enable the radiologists to use them optimally. Your R&D can't take place 3,000 miles away across this large pond and have the customers in a different context. Your R&D people and the customers have to be in constant interaction, so the key people have to move from UK to the US. You have to keep innovating aggressively. This is the way to keep the major competitors, the 800-pound gorillas, a step behind you. You have to defend your patents vigorously. Let me give you a couple more. You have to, while there's outsourcing maybe the initial way to do it, you need to bring the technology in-house so you can develop it further. And finally, to keep your customers and to increase their switching costs and to prevent the competition from nibbling at your market share, you need to provide a system solution. So this is true for all 4 scenarios. So instead of sitting there in paralysis, saying, I don't know when I'm selling 30 units or 3,000, I don't know when GE is going to come in next year or 3 years from now, you identify your robust actions, and this enables you to experiment and improve, but without being paralyzed, which is what would happen if you use your traditional analytical models and try to identify one scenario that's going to happen. It's not going to work that way. What I wanted to share with you, and I've given you a couple of other examples. This is one of my favorite examples developed by the Postal Service pre-9/11, 2001. The fascinating thing is the robust actions that they developed then in terms of what would happen in terms of responding to the scenarios caused by electronic diversion and the amount of pricing flexibility that they have. Every one of those robust actions are relevant even today. So I've given you a story built around this, why each of these is important. I've given you a couple of other examples too. If you talk about health systems, you can say, I don't know what to do, or you can use this possibility scenario approach and identify a set of robust actions that make sense that you can invest in while trying to figure out which scenario is actually going to emerge, so you're not paralyzed. This is a recent consulting assignment, can't go into details, but to give you a sense, you can do this in every industry, whether it is trucking, whether it's building trucks, whether it's postal service, whether it is medical technology, whether it's health systems. So the notion of robust actions is something I'd like you to keep in mind. In terms of style, just a very simple idea here. You cannot stay in this cell of existing business and existing competencies. I have stories, endless stories about how this is just not viable anymore. So there's the notion of how does one actually develop new competencies, and in order to keep, in a sense, a command of your existing business. How do you use existing competencies to get into new business, or how do you develop new competencies in order to keep your existing business viable? And of course, this transformational notion entirely of which was what you need for wicked problems, where the transformational structure that I showed you would help. So in terms of management roles in transformation, this is what we need to do: emphasize values, articulate aspirations, identify and develop competencies, develop alliances that keep you viable and developing new competencies. Your management systems have to support innovation, and communication is the key. And you have to emphasize communication. Now, these are self-explanatory. This is Jack Welch's notion, where he would say, really, people whose values are aligned with you, with organizations, and are high performance or the best, these are people who probably need to find another career. But the interesting thing is, he valued people who are aligned in values more than people who were not aligned with values and performing high, as compared to those who are aligned with values and performing low, not as well, because he saw the possibility of developing them. There's the notion of stretch goals. Your aspirations have got to move people towards transformation. So the notion of big, hairy, audacious goals and stretch goals is something we found out in our benchmarking studies. There's the notion of focusing on people. This is where the competencies lie. There's a notion of developing alliances in order to nurture new competencies. There's the notion of, essentially, I'm going to talk about just 2 things here: the notion of innovation, which involves working from the future back. That's feed forward, as opposed to feedback, which is the traditional model. The distribution system is something I'd like you to keep in mind, because that sort of separates you from your customer unless you're careful. So not having anything keeping you from the customer is critically important in this kind of arena. Resource allocation, again, this looks difficult, but there are methodologies that can enable you to use qualitative criteria to study different alternatives. And there are methodologies such as the analytic hierarchy process that's offered in 2 software packages. One is called expert choice, and another is called super decisions, that enable you to use multiple qualitative criteria with multiple decision makers. There's the notion, again, of focusing on new market segments, which is contrary to what we teach in the strategy classes. You have to go outside your zone of comfort in order to develop strategy and force you to think of transformation. And going global and to the bottom of the pyramid is a powerful stimulus for transformation. And of course, I cannot overemphasize the importance of communication. And we found, regardless of industry, regardless of country, face-to-face communication is absolutely key. So to summarize, in terms of taming wicked problems, identify what the organization's core, enduring, and distinctive characteristics are. What is its identity? One of my colleagues uses a nice mnemonic. He talks about the ABC model: aspirations, beliefs, and competencies. He uses beliefs instead of values, but it's a nice mnemonic, and using this to evaluate all your decisions. The notion of a modular organizational structure, which we talked about. The idea of using possibility scenarios, identifying robust actions, and utilizing feed-forward oriented performance measures, it's critically important. And finally, the notion in culture saying, how do I obsolete myself before the competition does? And those are the four notions we need to look at. I'll put this in a little slide which compares existing models of strategy development with models that are appropriate for wicked problems. It's self-explanatory, and you'll be getting the slides, so I won't spend time on them. This is a fascinating article that I would recommend to you because GE's activities capture most of the ideas that I was talking about. So GE is really taking an enormous risk in terms of implementing many of these ideas, but it's a very, very powerful notion. This, again, is how GE is disrupting itself, October 2009, Harvard Business Review. Fascinating article. And finally, of course, I have to suggest reading this article which I wrote. But with that, let me just wrap up and say, looking forward to any of your questions, and I hope you found this an initial notion of what might be helpful to you as you distinguish between traditional strategic problems and the challenge of wicked problems, which are going to be more and more commonplace today. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. Just a tremendous discussion. We have a couple of questions. One question is, you talk about learning. However, doesn't the wicked problem solver have no right to be wrong? They're fully responsible for their actions. Can you comment on that?
There's a fascinating idea here, Bill, which you got to recognize. The notion of being wrong and being a failure actually doesn't apply in this paradigm. It doesn't apply. A few years ago, I was traveling the world trying to identify the answer to a question, which is, when do you determine that your strategy is obsolete and you need to discard it and develop a new strategy? Or do you actually need to invest more in the existing strategy? And if companies had the answer to that question, they would be in terrific shape. And one of the companies I spoke to was in Japan, a major computer company. And when I asked top management this, they essentially gave me no answer whatsoever. And I found out later when talking to an American executive who was there, who said, really, in this company, that question that you asked, when is a major project a failure, or when is a strategy a failure, he said it does not apply because this company realizes that major projects and strategies, and major projects in particular, are likely to end up very differently than you planned them. And what they were focusing on is how quickly did you identify that your assumptions were wrong, how quickly did you identify that things needed to be done differently. And the idea of this being a failure was not an issue. The idea was really how quickly do you identify that you are quote-unquote wrong and need to change. And this is very difficult for especially the American mindset. It's in our culture. It's because, let me give you it's even in the language. The way we say it is, Bill broke the vase, right? Mm-hmm. In Japan, the way it's phrased is, the vase broke itself. If you look at the way we phrase it here, clearly the most important notion is, who's the culprit? Whom do we hang from the nearest tree? In the Japanese phrasing, it is, really, the vase is broken. Why did that happen? How did it happen? What do we do differently? So the notion of being wrong, it's really not appropriate here. The notion is we're engaging in experiments, and being wrong, quote unquote, is actually input to our decision making.
Terrific. Thank you. Just briefly, what I'd like to do is, I'm sorry.
There's a question that came up about blue ocean strategy, which that's an interesting notion that I think we need to recognize. And blue ocean strategy is a very powerful model that's been developed by Kim and Marbone. It's sort of more close to the traditional strategy formulation model. Essentially, it asks you to differentiate your strategy and create a blue ocean where no competition currently exists. But the baseline is what exists, and how does one do things differently from there, as opposed to in the wicked problem situation, saying the baseline is what the possibilities are in the future and working from that, and constantly transforming yourself. So it's a very powerful notion, but it's more closely aligned to existing classic blue ocean strategy, is more closely aligned to classic strategy models as opposed to what you're suggesting in terms of wicked problems.
Thank you.